So there's been a lot of interest in African blades recently. Matt Easton did a video on 15 different types of African sword, and now Skullagram has done a video talking about the rounded point as seen in swords like my favorite, the Takoba. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the design elements I've noticed in research about the Takoba sword. So here I have my Takoba. I don't have a fat boy like Matt Easton, I'm jealous, but you can see the triangular shape, a little bit less exaggerated as in the bigger example, but it's still there with the base being wider than the tip. Now, in Skellergren's video, he was kind of confused by this as Matt Easton explained it as this tip is to optimize cutting ability. And he said, well, surely if you're trying to optimize cutting ability, wouldn't you just have a fat tip all the way through with no, narrowing? And I feel like this is a design element of the sword. So one of the theories that he proposes is that it's some kind of like material science thing. And I feel like to an extent it is. I feel like part of it is this shape helps reinforce the tip. Because the Takoba, in my opinion, is a tip cutting sword. It can cut and is sharp throughout most of its length. But when I use it either in sparring or use it in cut testing, I primarily just cut with this first part of the blade. The reason for this is, one, it gives me the most reach. And like in unarmored combat, reach is really important because that space between you and the opponent really gives you a lot more protection than coming in close when you don't have the safety of armor to kind of ward away lighter hits. So that's one thing about this sword, is that with having this tip like this, I can essentially cut from farther out. Now, Skullagram also says in his video, okay, so if this is a tip cutting sword, or if this is a sword that tries to extend its sweet spot all the way out like this, well, why didn't they just make it the same width throughout the blade? Or why didn't they fatten the tip to give more mass to this end? And I feel like this has to do with how the sword is used when you fight with it. So the Takoba uses a lot of flourishes and spins and things like that when you fight with it. And it's a very quick and nimble sword. And it's very saber-like in its use. And part of the reason for that is that it has a really high point of balance. So I'll just show you. This is the point of balance on this sword, which is like 9 to 8.5 inches. And there are examples that have even higher point of balances, up to 12 inches away from the guard, but average more around 10, 10.5, 11. So this sword has a really high point of balance. And what that does is when you swing it, it really wants to continue that momentum. I don't know if you saw the video I did with Sensei Seth, but there's a part of the video where I'm doing it just single sword, and I'm basically doing a bunch of flourishes. And one of the reasons it's so easy to do that is that this sword really preserves momentum really well with the high point of balance. The other secret to this sword is it's blade heavy. And that's kind of, you already see that with the point of balance, but what I'm really saying is that this hilt on the end of the Takoba is actually extremely lightweight. So it's just like a plate of metal covered with some leather. And then this is like a hollow piece of wood. And then it has this brass cap. And these hilts, even though they look, big and robust, and they are tough enough to take a hit, they could stop a cut, they actually are very lightweight. And it's funny because when we were doing my personal sword, the Heavenly Albatross, one of the things that we had the hardest time replicating, well, Osa had difficulty replicating, and we figured it out, was how to get a hilt light enough to preserve that point of balance. Now, we did do some tricks. For example, we used this Cold Steel Scottish broadsword, which, as you notice, has kind of like one of those spatulate kind of pointed tips, sort of like a Cascara, similar, where it still is mostly rounded, but it does have a point that's good enough to thrust. And that's kind of a feature I just wanted. But this hilt and this is like a fancier Takoba hilt that I'm trying to emulate. This hilt was thrown off the point of balance, and even on this, the point of balance is, I don't know, like 6 inches from the guard. And it's funny, when I was researching that the heavier Takobas, the point of balance is a little bit closer to the guard than normal. And I think it's just because when you make these fancy hilts, it kind of, costs you some of your point of balance. So like we were trying to get as far as possible, but with all of this brass plates and things like that, we got to like 6 inches. But even then, it's still a very high point of balance when you compare it to a lot of other swords. And so, it acts like a pendulum when you swing it. The other thing is, with the triangular shape, essentially, I feel like as far as the material science of it, like Skellgren proposed that it might be a material science reason, is I feel like this triangular shape helps reinforce the point. If this is a point cutting sword, and if there's different metallurgies and things like that, having this tapering, like a wider base and then tapering to this slightly narrower point, this point is still pretty wide, honestly. It kind of reinforces, it kind of makes this a really strong, at least within the cutting plane. And when I cut with this, you can slam through material with this. Like this section, even though this blade is flexible, so it flexes easy, but on the plane of cutting, it's very, very rigid. It wants to bite into a target. And one of the things that I like to do with it, one, can it thrust? Yes, to a certain extent. Don't believe me? Here's a cardboard box. Here's me thrusting into the cardboard box. Once again, cardboard box, thrust into the cardboard box. So it can thrust, but also, if I bring in the handy dandy cardboard box again, you can just kind of, like pile drive into stuff. So like one thing I like to do is just, use that tip cut and then push in. I don't know if this would work on a human, honestly, but it's something I noticed that you can do, where even with, harder materials, sometimes I can kind of cheat my thrust by basically swinging into it and then just pushing the blade through once I already like broke through the surface. So that's the other thing. These tip cuts can actually penetrate material really well. And this rounded tip is actually better at that kind of attack, where you're just using like the very, very tip of the weapon to get through things. The other reason why I feel like it wasn't just a material, it was a choice. It wasn't just like the metallurgy isn't good enough to support it, is we have other African swords to look at, even from the same region. So if you go to Cameroon, you have this Tudu sword. And what's this? It has a point. It has a very pointy point. This sword is kind of Takoba-like. It's a lot, lighter than a Takoba. It still has that high point of balance. And look at this hilt. Like I said, with the Takoba, really, really light hilt. This is literally just some leather wrapped around the tang, and then it has this kind of like counterweight blade thing. But this hilt is pretty minimalistic. As you can see, it's not much of a stop or guard or anything like that. It just kind of fits around your hand. This is still a sword that can cut really well, but it has this point. But one thing I noticed with this is, this sword doesn't you have to basically choke up on it more. So like the cutting section for this sword is further in than it is on the Takoba. The Takoba can cut all the way at the tip. This can kind of cut at the tip, but it's much, much more reduced. But these type of swords were available too, so it's not like people weren't making pointy swords. They also had daggers. So there are various types of like arming daggers that were around, like this right here. So this is my trainer of like a Tuareg arm dagger. They're called this because they would be strapped to your arm, and you can look up pictures of how that would work. But this is like your tertiary sidearm, and you can't see it here because safety, don't want to kill my training partner, but this blade is really pointy too. And these vary from, this is like a medium size to very, very small, like tiny dagger ones, to basically gladiuses. So this is so they have the Tudu sword. So you have pointed swords in the same Sahelian region, or different cultural groups are using pointier swords. You have the arm dagger, which basically everyone had. So pointy gladius type weapons were available too. You had sabers, like this Manding saber. The ones with access to the Islamic world had access to things like shamshirs and all the straight swords and stuff you find in Islam. You see this point here. And finally, when you go to West Africa and the coastal regions of the Sahel, the more coastal forest kingdom near people, they had access to European goods such as cutlasses. And so basically, they wanted a point, they could have had a point because there were other swords available to them that had points. And so the idea that it's just like a metallurgical kind of like structural issue that they were compensating for kind of falls flat when you see all the different variety of weapons you even had just within the Sahelian region. The other thing is, a lot of Takobas were trade blades. And being trade blades, a lot of times they had points. And the native smiths would grind them off. So you have a European sword with a point, and they're taking the point off. So they're buying a sword with a point, and they're taking it off. Because, it shows it's a design thing, because, like, why would I go through the effort of destroying, not wear and tear, not that the point breaks off, not that the point, becomes unusable over time. I buy my brand new sword, and I grind the point off. Because, thrusting wasn't really the way that fighting was even done. And even swords that are more pointy, like for example the Manding saber I showed you, or the Flylisa, were still primarily cutting swords, even though you could technically perform a thrust with this. And this one's actually the point's actually not that defined, even though it's not actually that sharp, but they still would primarily cut. And so, in conclusion, actually, one more thing. West Africa, so let's get out of the Sahel. You got swords like this, Opita, where they very much did blob out the sweet spot at the end. So they also had contact or access to people who were carrying swords like this. So if you look at like a West Africa general region thing, people tried all sorts of different ideas of how to, have a point, affect the point of balance, pull it back, pull it forward. All of them are min-max sort of things. The Takoba isn't necessarily a result of, lack of skill or ability, because one, African smiths were quite skilled, and the metallurgy actually wasn't too bad in Africa, especially if you talk about the Sahel region. Another thing is they could import blades from Europe, so even like later on, or the Islamic world. So they had really, really high quality blades too that were coming in, and they would still grind off the point. So I think it's aesthetics, you want to look like someone from your region. You want a sword that, symbolizes that, but also this sword really, this is the business end. And if you're in an area where you don't really need as much point work per se, this is good because you optimize the cut without really slowing your weapon down. And that's kind of the difference between this and the Opita, is that this is faster than the Opita. This can, like, you know, I can swing this around all day. I won't get tired. The Opita is more like a, you know, here comes the pain, you know, bring it down and you destroy your enemy sort of thing. And I'm getting rambly. And then last point is, you know, spear's pretty ubiquitous in Africa too. So, you know, at the end of the day, this is going to outthrust any sword, more or less. So, yeah. So that's my thoughts. I think the Takoba design is really an optimization for the type of combat and environment they found themselves in. I think that the tip is really designed for tip cutting. I feel like it was a choice. It wasn't so much like a metallurgical issue with the round tips. And I think the reasoning behind why it narrows out like that is kind of to preserve the momentum of the blade. And also, another point, the other thing is when you cut with it, less resistance, because the more steel that has to pass through the target, the more it's going to slow down. So you get this high point of balance sword, and you have a smaller surface area in which to basically slam into targets with. So that little tip, traveling at the speed it's going in with the less surface area, it hits a bare, you know, piece of you, and it's just going to sink and cut through things. And so that's kind of the design. All right, well, that's my thoughts. Hopefully people continue their interest in African swords. I think that there's a lot to discuss. There's a lot to discover, and I encourage this continued interest. All right, bye guys.